Well, hello everyone, and welcome. I'm James Harding, editor and co-founder of Tortoise, and we are talking in this education summit about some of the biggest and most searching questions, and they would have been had it not been for COVID-19. They would have been questions about the rewiring of our society, the world of work, and our individual potential. They're all reimagined, of course, as a result of the coronavirus, and perhaps no conversation more than the one that's going to come in the next 45 minutes. Because the subject before us now is how we need to rethink education for the rest of our lives. How do we rethink the education system when we realize that we're living with the death of the job for life? And I'm really grateful to Heather McGowan, the author of the Adaptation Challenge, to Joe Johnson, the former higher education minister in the UK, now deeply involved, I think, as chair of the TES and involved with King's College too on the future of the knowledge economy, and hugely grateful too to Lord Kerslake, to Bob Kerslake, who are going to help us, who ran the civil service and has been one of the big thinkers on public policy in our country, the UK. I hope that between the three of them will give us some real structure for thinking about what we are going to do about lifelong learning. I want to say that we wouldn't be having these conversations if it weren't in part for the backing we've had from Santander, the headline partner for our education summit, also actually from 2020 Delivery and the Nuffield Foundation, one of our delivery partners today. I'm really struck by one piece of evidence that we've gathered at Tortoise, which is that when we went out and we surveyed people and asked how many people think that their job prospects have been changed by the coronavirus, they said 58% of people said that that would have a material impact on what they thought would happen in their careers, in their jobs. Santander did a survey of young people across 14 countries. Again, the majority of people thought that this would have an impact on their jobs in the next 5 years. So if you like, this is not in any way a theoretical conversation. It's an intensely practical and immediate one. And I'm going to ask Heather, if you would, to help us start this conversation. And I hope everyone on the call by now knows that a thinking at Tortoise really is a conversation. Weigh in the chat, put your hand up, and I'll bring you in. But Heather, would you kick it off for us and give us a sense of how you think we can adapt, how we can make that constant process of adaptation actually part of our education system, so that we live with the pace of change that's an inevitable part of what's happening in the economy.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. So I'm in the U.S., so some of the facts and figures I might spout out and the perspective that I might share is it's global, but it's really grounded here because this is where I'm from. So Chris Shipley and I wrote this book called The Adaptation Advantage to answer this question, essentially. We have created our systems of work and learning all geared towards creating a single occupational identity. We ask little kids what they want to be when they grow up. We ask university students to pick a major, often before they step foot on campus. And if you think about that, they're picking a future self based upon some pretty significant social factors: who's in their social circle, what they're exposed at in what's high school for us, and more importantly, what they're told they're good and not good at. Very, very limiting for your future. And then many of our systems of higher ed get you myopically focused on your first job. And we know by now that the career for life or the job for life has been gone for several decades.
Yeah.
And we haven't caught up with that. And when you look at in the US anyway, our systems are all, our K-12 system figures out who's smart, our primary school system. Our high school system focuses on getting you into the right university. Our university system focuses on a single major and your first job. And that whole system is completely absurd when you realize that we're probably going to have 16 or 17 different jobs across 5 different industries. So the whole process of kind of asking somebody, hey, what do you do? You're asking them to define themselves entirely by the application of skills in a moment in time. And we focus on codifying and transferring set skills into you to get you that first job, rather than helping you understand What are you curious about? What are you passionate about? What do you think your purpose might be? What are some of the superpowers you have? How can you expose yourself to more experiences so you get a sense of agency and you're constantly upskilling and reskilling so that your job, whatever you do today, becomes your application of skills and knowledge at that moment in time, but you're ready for the next one. So upskilling and reskilling isn't something you do when you get laid off, but something you do every day as a natural part of your evolution.
And Heather, just to be precise about it, whose responsibility is that? I know you might say it's everyone's, but are you saying, okay, the state is going to have to do that. It's going to have to provide education, post-school and university for our whole lives long. Are you saying that there should be a mandated even expectation on businesses to provide those reskilling, upskilling services through employment? Or are you saying that we individuals should be investing our money in that process, through our 20s, 30s, all the way into our 80s and 90s?
That very question alone, which I completely understand, is rooted in today's paradigm. So it's just saying, okay, well, who's going to pay for it? Education is going somewhere to get something. When you look at work, you speed up work. When everything technology, when everything mentally routine or predictable, or nearly everything can be achieved by some form of technology, what's left in work is learning. So suddenly learning becomes an organizational's competitive advantage. And
Right.
so investing in it, and it's not necessarily going to get a degree or going to get a certificate. I'm talking about learning scientists being embedded in organizations and learning as part of what we do. But in terms of responsibility, we can't tell somebody, hey, now it's your responsibility when we haven't set that expectation up. When we haven't taught them to connect to their own motivational drive, which I think is purpose, if we haven't helped them in our systems of education be predisposed to be lifelong learners. The companies in the US that have made it through sort of massive change have done so by investing in education. Companies like AT&T who said, we have 250,000 employees, 100,000 of them don't have degrees, don't have the underlying foundational knowledge in order to make it through our transition to digital. So we can either lay off 100,000 people and then look to hire another 100,000 people because we don't think our actual numbers are going to change that much, or we can building a learning infrastructure that's better for our organization and cater to our industry, which is what they did. They invested $1 billion.
Right. Wow. Okay. So it's your real investment. Well, Heather, I hope that we'll bring in people working in different businesses who've got a point about doing exactly what Heather's describing. But Joe, can I bring you in? How do you see this? Someone once said, it's very nice to see you. Someone once said to me, Joe, that you could start the Third World War in the middle of a discussion about lifelong learning. I think Tony Blair said that, in fact. What's your feeling about how difficult it is? Why is this such an obvious thing that needs to be done and it's so hard to get done?
Well, I echo everything Heather said, and thanks for asking me, James, onto your platform. Congratulations on hosting this Tortoise Education Summit. It's brilliant. I've been learning a lot from the interactive comments as well. Look, Heather's obviously right. This job for life thing has been gone for years. You're only about 1.5% of people entering the workforce today will have one job throughout a working life that will span 5 decades. Yet, paradoxically, although this has been a phenomenon that's been with us for a long time, successive governments have done a pretty poor job at planning for it. So the question itself is still relevant. We do still need to plan for something, even though we've actually been living with it as a society for quite a few years now. From my point of view, I think that Tony Blair quote is still very relevant. Skills policy is not actually the sexiest part of what governments do. They seldom get a huge amount of focus in Parliament or from the senior levels of any administration. And I think that has to change, because as you said in your introduction, we were already pre-coronavirus facing phenomenal challenges due to automation and changes in the structure of the workforce that were meaning that many people with lower levels of skills, the third of adults who don't have more than a level 2 qualification, were increasingly ill-adapted to the way modern economies were developing. So we did have a major challenge even before coronavirus. And with coronavirus leading to potentially significant rises in unemployment and restructuring of major sectors of the economy, these challenges are now even more important. So this has to rise up the political agenda. And I've been encouraged by some of the steps and some of the announcements in recent weeks. The government, for example, saying that there will be an apprenticeship guarantee. So they are recognizing that real action needs now to happen and there needs to be a real focus. I think there are a few easy things that they should start doing to make that apprenticeship guarantee meaningful. I think you've got to support employers with a subsidy. An apprenticeship is a kind of job, it is a job. And I think it's a logical extension of the coronavirus job retention scheme that you now put in place some support for employers to provide those apprenticeship opportunities which we've been talking about. Second, we've definitely got to address the crisis in adult part-time education. It is time and long overdue to put back in place some form of grant funding for part-time education. Some recent steps in this respect have been really good. So, for example, that you have been able to get a loan to undertake a second degree part-time in a STEM subject. And there are now loans available for people to undertake higher levels of study, such as master's courses, but putting in place that grant funding for adult learners who are more debt averse, I think will help us reverse the staggering decline in adult part-time education, which we've seen over the last decade. So those are some of the kinds of things which we do need to start doing really urgently if we're going to prepare ourselves for the post-coronavirus employment world that we're going into very, very rapidly.
Joe, can I just, on the grant funding for part-time education, how many people, how much money?
Well, we've seen a big decline, James, in part-time higher education. As you know, it's declined by about 70%. This was an unforeseen and unintended consequence of in part it was of the change in funding regime for higher education introduced by successive governments starting in the late 90s, but obviously developed during the sort of second term Blair government and then further by the coalition government. That progressive change in the way we funded universities has really had a big and unforeseen, unintended, undesired effect on part-time learners, and we need to learn some of the lessons from that, putting back in place specifically for disadvantaged part-time learners some grant funding to help them overcome some of the reservations that they've got about the debt that comes with study.
Okay. Well, I mean, I'd love to think in more detail about exactly what's needed in terms of grants. But can I just come back, Joe, to this point about reskilling that Heather touched on? I have to confess, when I hear people talk about reskilling at the moment, my heart slightly sinks because there's so much talk about it. But if you think about the incentives the government has long put in place in the UK and many other economies for investment in technology and innovation, it's never really had the same system of investments, of incentives, around investment in people on the scale that Heather's talking about. And when we talk about supporting apprenticeships, that doesn't necessarily help your 30, 40, 50, 60, 70-year-olds trying to reskill while they're in employment. So surely there needs to be something that goes way beyond apprenticeship support if you're going to actually financially incentivize companies to deliver on reskilling.
Yeah, I mean, look, there are calls for a similar tax break for training that's provided to R&D, for example, and there may be some merit in that. And I think you're absolutely right that it has to go beyond apprenticeships for the classic 16 to 24-year-old group. There are apprenticeships for the 25 plus learners, and the kind of subsidy to the employer that I talked about would need to be made available to those 25-year plus learners. And it's not just apprenticeships that the government needs to focus on. It's quite possible to reskill and burnish your capabilities without acquiring a formal credential or qualification. And one of the positive things that I think's come out of the coronavirus crisis has been the focus across government on building up a sort of a database and bank of resources that people can tap into and use at any point in their life without necessarily acquiring a formal credential or qualification at the end of it. And this is on the government's so-called skills toolkit website, which is populated by content from good providers such as FutureLearn, which is part of the Open University, and others. So there are lots of ways in which governments can tap into this. I think it's time we had a lot more flexibility in our student funding system as well. Presently, there is a sort of a mindset in the Treasury that a good education outcome always ends in a classic degree, a 3-year degree or a master's program. There isn't yet the mindset in the Treasury that recognizes the value and therefore the public benefit in funding credits, modules, micro-credentials, stackable qualifications that are relevant to people who want a quick route back into the workforce and just want to access some kind of learning relatively quickly. So I do think we need a major overhaul of our mindset towards what we regard as useful courses of study and their duration. And that will require a very big reform of the student loan company, which is at the moment completely not set up to offer funding as a result of government policy. It's not set up to do so, and to offer funding for those kinds of courses.
Joe, thank you. I'm going to bring in Bob Kerslake, and then I'm going to start bringing in many of the people who've raised points in the chat. But Lord Kerslake, thank you for doing this. And will you just pick up, or I mean, just start with the point Joe left with, which is that we just don't have a proper mindset around the delivery of things other than degrees. Is that a fair point about?
I mean, it's completely fair, and I 100% agree with everything that Alison and indeed Joe has said about this agenda. We need to start with the scale of the shock of coronavirus, really. It's going to effectively double unemployment in this country, and we're at risk of very particular groups, young people, being scarred for a long period. So coronavirus has been a huge shock, but it's one amongst many that we're going to face in the next decade. Some people have called it a decade of disruption, and just on the digital side, high-value jobs will be at risk, not just low-skilled jobs. Things that we would have seen as pretty safe in the past will be at risk: accountancy, finance, and so on. So we are heading into a period of disruption, and we're also heading into a period where if we don't actively plan for that, then it will affect people unequally, even more unequally at the moment. Of course, Alison is right that the job for life has been dead for some time. It's just the rate of change now that's going on that's increased pretty rapidly. And I personally believe that the government policy has been a factor here across governments. I think Joe's absolutely right about that. But actually also the attitude of institutions, and in particular universities. It's been simpler and easier to focus on undergraduates coming out of school than it has to maintain and progress adult education. And we need a complete revolution in the thinking here. And universities now need to focus not just on that, their bigger role, if you like, in terms of what they've been perceived as doing, but to become genuinely civic universities that serve their local area. So government policy changes can help. The relaxing of the ELQ rule, for example, the 25% intensity rule, and indeed funding courses, as Joe said, that don't lead to a degree. So all of those things can help here, but it's going to take two to tango. And I think coronavirus, if it does nothing else, should lead us to a fundamental rethink by universities themselves about their future role and how they work with others in their local education system, particularly further education. So COVID could be a great accelerator here. It's up to us.
No, I can see that. Can you help us, and if you like, flip the conversation the other way around? Instead of talking about institutions and delivery, if you like, start with the individual. I know I shouldn't do this, but let's take you and me, right? My education, my formal education ended in the early 90s, right? I haven't had a period of really formal education since then. and it's really worrying me. And I don't know what you think the option for me should be. Are you thinking I should be spending a day a week, an afternoon a week, 3 months every second year? How do you think education in this, God willing, second half of my life or your life should work? What's the mechanism?
Well, it's very kind of you to compare us, but I think I'm in retirement now and doing lots of different things, I have to say, rather than just one. But I think, taking your point, really, it has to be a personal responsibility to kind of think about where your next job, exactly as Alison said, where does your next...
I think Heather you're talking about. Yeah.
But I think the reason why I focus on the institutions is because even if people themselves get the need for change, get the need to invest in their personal learning, if the basic mechanisms to support them doing that don't exist in employers, in our educational institutions, and in government, then the barriers will be too high and they will fall back. Some will be determined enough, but not enough. And if we really want to tackle some of the growing inequalities in our society, we have to see action from the state and indeed from providers. So yes, of course, the individual can play an enormously important role here. And it will be driven by where they think their current job is and where they think their future opportunities lie.
But that's very interesting, Bob. You're saying that this has to be provision-led. It's not going to be individual demand-led in that sense. It's going to have to be provision-led.
No, I think it should be demand-led. And frankly, what I'm trying to say is that what we need is an agility in our educational systems that recognises a much more complex, fast-moving world. So, and some have already recognised that. So I think in Teach First, they've made it easier for people to transition from one job to another. The professions, some of the professions are now seeing that if you have to train for 5 or 6 years to get into a profession, that's probably going to be too long. So I think we are seeing shifts in the thinking in a number of ways, but it's not fast enough and it's not far enough, is my point.
Great, thank you. Heather, I'm going to come back to you in a moment, but if I might, what I'd love to do is just pull in a number of people who have either got their hands up or raised points in the chat while you and Joe and Bob have been speaking. Can I bring in some of them? I can see that Antonia Weiss, you're here, and then I'm going to come to Lucy Huberman in a second. Antonia.
Hello.
Hi there.
Hi. So I think Mike, just picking up on the point that Bob raised about this being a crisis and effectively considering this as a crisis, and then one of the routes into how do you solve that is by treating it as if it were a crisis. And though that's a negative mindset, I think there are some reasons to be cheerful here. So on the one hand, we know who's most affected. So we're 9 million odd furloughed. Many of those will become unemployed, disproportionately affecting younger workers within the services sector. So we know who to target. We also are pretty well, briefed on what skills are going to be required for the future, and those are overwhelmingly digital data and technical literacy skills. And actually, there's a huge amount of content provision of that. The devil is in the delivery. And then the third area is that we already have lots of pre-existing institutions to have this, of which I think FE has been much underloved and neglected, but of course we have the National Retraining Scheme getting up and running, National Career Service. So the challenge is a matching problem. And I think that is where there is both the interplay of the onus of the responsibility on the individual, but also on the state in bridging what's effectively an information asymmetry about what's out there. And there's a few good examples, I think, from the pandemic, which can show where actually proactively, particularly on a local level, local authorities have reached out to help people with their health needs. I think you could think about that as well with their job and future career prospect needs as well.
Interesting. I mean, this speaks exactly the point that Joe was making, wasn't it, about how we think about education provision, in the round, rather than quite so as formulaically as we have for a long time. Antonio, thank you. I'm going to just bring in Lucy Huberman and Ruth Massey, and then come back to Heather and Joe for a minute. Lucy.
Okay, thank you very much. I just wanted to make 2 points. I think a lot of people in the chat say, obviously, Jobs for Life went 20 years ago. I'm, I think, in my 3rd emanation. I've worked in a university for 11 years, but I was hired from industry, so I'm not a career academic. I came in as what's called a professorial fellow to help other academics and do academic research myself, but to help others provide impact, which means getting real life measures out of their academic research, which I thought was quite a good thing. But what I learned, and I'm actually leaving Warwick in the next month, I'll be a bit careful what I say. What I've learned is that following from what Joe Johnson said about Treasury priorities, you have to also look at how universities are funded. So they're also funded via government, and the mechanisms for awarding them funding are enshrined in the Research Excellence Framework. I don't want to get too technical because I don't actually know all the technicalities. But what that means is the more your research staff, not your teaching staff, the more your research staff perform well. And what that means is publishing in high-ranking journals. Mm-hmm. Okay, there's a huge pecking order in journals. The more you publish in the high-ranking journals, the more sort of points you get and the more funding you get per academic. And it's a completely vicious circle, really. There's also a huge hierarchy, which someone else will know why this has happened. But within the Research Excellence Framework, there are, I think, 36 categories. So for someone like me that comes from the BBC and Channel 4 and media and digital communications and all these skills that are apparently wanted, the subject matter of media and communications is number 36, is the bottom of the list. Top of the list is science, which I think, obviously very, very important. We have a fantastic science and innovation base. But to sum up, I just want to say that what is prioritized by the funding mechanism is sort of quantitative research and scientific research, which is great. But qualitative research is also really, really important. Yes. In my university, it's not rated as highly. The previous vice chancellor said he saw it as a science-based university, which okay. And practice-based research, which is really what I'm interested in, because I make things and do things, and I like to help other people make and do things, is really the bottom of the pile.
Oh, that's really, Lucy, that's so interesting. I mean, I always feel bad because often when we're in these thinkings, I'll dismiss an issue as being academic. And then you realize, particularly in this context, that's not that helpful. But I do appreciate your point that sometimes academia rewards things that feel, to use the pejorative meaning of the word academic. Ruth, Massey, can I just bring you in as well, just because you made a point which I think speaks to Joe's point about the stack of lessons we can learn, about kind of when learning should end.
Thank you very much. And Lucy's point, I think, is really interesting in how we fund universities. There's the old thing about, we look at what we manage by what we fund. But I wanted to talk about the learning journey. So I'm the education lead for a proposed new university in Milton Keynes that we're hoping to launch in 2023. That's looking at digital skills and STEM skills. And we're going through this process of working out, what does a modern university look like? What does a modern university need to be thinking about? And we talk an awful lot about the students' learning journey. And that learning journey starts right at the beginning of their lives, goes all the way through education. But we kind of have this kind of concept that it finishes somehow at the end of your undergraduate degree, for some people at the end of their master's degree. But actually, what we're thinking of when we think about MKU and the lifelong journey that students have is that it's not just about what you do in the 18 to 21 world. It's about where you go next and how you think about education as being a journey that you're on, that you never stop, that you're always learning new things. There's an excellent book called The 100-Year Life, which we've been looking at, on whether it's right or wrong, but that talks about having 3 distinct careers through your life. One being around entrepreneurship and innovation. The next one being a more settled traditional career, as we would see it. There's a 9 to 5. Not that any of us do 9 to 5 these days. And then moving on to a more compassionate career that might be evolving around citizenship kind of activities. And all of those need different stages and different education, and the university needs to understand that the students don't finish at 21. That's not the end of your education. that's just another step on that learning journey.
Yeah, and Ruth, sorry to interrupt. In the case of Milton Keynes University, MKU, so I don't know much about its plans, are you thinking too about provision beyond students in their early 20s? Is there going to be capacity to serve people who are older?
Absolutely. So what we're looking at is a model that's much more flexible. So we've got a 3-stage kind of approach about generalizing. So you get a broad knowledge, then specializing into your individual degree topic, and then individualizing. But what we're aiming to do is have full-time students on 2-year degrees, full-time students on 3-year degrees, students who are doing placement years as well, apprenticeship students and part-time students, and making sure we're doing a big exercise around timetabling at the moment, making sure that we can actually timetable this in so they can, I mean, working as an 18-year-old with a part-time student who's in their 40s and has 20 years of work experience brings something real depth to the classroom. Online, as we are now. So actually we're looking at just the simple logistics around timetabling. How would you even do that? And we're great. We've got a blank piece of paper so we can really think about these kind of things.
Ruth, how so interesting. Well, I hope we'll keep in touch because I'd love to learn how that develops.
It's one of the most amazing projects I think going on in education in the UK at the moment. It's the first undergraduate university that's been developed in a long time in the UK. So it's a great privilege to be on the project.
Amazing. Joe, can I come back to you? I know this is going to seem like a silly thing to say, but let's say you put coronavirus aside, right? I know that seems like a flip thing. It's not meant to be. It's just to say you've thought about this for a long time. If you were trying to set out on a blank piece of paper how you deal with education in the workplace, education over time beyond schools and universities, how would you do it? And to the question I asked Heather, also, I know it's kind of slightly practical, but how would you fund it? Is it a government issue? Is it a company issue? Is it an individual loans and investment issue? How do you approach it?
I think you've got to approach it when you're in government with great humility. I think there's no evidence at all that we're good at workforce planning, identifying the skills that are going to be needed in the economy of the future. So I think that starting point leads me to say that you need a system that's led by the needs of learners and by the needs of businesses, and that should shape what you fund. So if learners are coming to you and expressing a desire to study in certain areas, governments should follow the cue from that. They are smart, they know what's in their best interests, and provided it's being delivered by a provider who's been appropriately quality assured by the right regulatory body, then government should be willing, up to the limits of the fiscal constraints that all governments are subject to fund it. Where I think there is great risk is when governments start identifying specific subjects and specific disciplines that they're going to prioritize, and conversely, where there are specific subjects and disciplines that they're going to defund because they're out of fashion for one reason or another. Now, I see great danger right now, for example, in the reimposition of student number controls in higher education, and the way that potentially could end up being used as a means of rationing funding into certain subject areas and prioritizing it into others. I don't see there's any evidence we're good at workforce planning in that way. And I think there's huge danger, for example, to the social sciences and to arts and humanities, which are so essential for driving big parts of our economy, such as the creative industries, if we go far down that road. And that's a trap which I think we're in danger of falling into right now.
That we're sort of picking educational winners, and we shouldn't be doing that.
No, we should.
But Joe, can I just press on one thing though, which is, I know that every kind of area in the world on a map is the size of Wales, and every good scheme comes out of Singapore. But can I just ask about the Singaporean example? People say that the Singaporean credit system for adult education is one that we should look at, and one that we might even want to emulate. Do you think that's right? Which is the country that does this best, and what should we learn from them?
Well, James, there are good models around the world. It's never easy to copy and paste different countries' educational systems into our own structures. There've often been calls for us to emulate Germany's, for example. It's never easy to do so, but obviously our great civil service and ministers should be responsive to best practice around the world and where it's relevant to try and learn from it.
I guess what I'm really specifically talking about, Joe, is this idea, if you want to respond to learners, I can understand how you say, okay, how I respond to businesses. What I don't understand is how do you enable learners to say, look, I want in this phase of my life to learn X or Y skill and to have the funding available to do that? What's the mechanism for that?
Well, again, another caution that I would put out is we've got to learn from the lessons of the past. And there is the temptation to reach for a lifelong learning account. Tony Blair tried it with the independent learning accounts. It's been revived in the Auger Review, which has sort of come up with a close cousin of what was attempted 20 odd years ago. I see real risks that will replicate all of the mistakes we saw in the past of dead weight, i.e. government funding courses which would have been paid for by the individuals themselves anyway, poor provision by low quality, poorly regulated, poorly quality assured providers, fraud on a massive scale. I remember when I was a minister in the Department for Education, we were still clearing up the fraud from the independent learning accounts 20 years before. So I really think we need to be very careful before suddenly reaching for a quick solution of, okay, let's give everyone a lifelong learning account. I think we need to be smarter than that.
Right, okay. Heather, I'm going to come back to you in one moment. I've had a couple of people who've had their hands up and been waiting for a while. So if I might, I'm going to bring in Atish Mistry because I saw your suggestion, I was intrigued by it, and then Russell Wellbeing too.
Yeah, and thank you. And I think it's useful to give context. So myself, I worked in investment banking for 10 years and I'm retraining to become a maths teacher out of choice. And my partner is a nurse and works for the NHS. So I'm enrolled in a program which is called Now Teach. It was set up by Lucy Kellaway. And what, sorry?
I just said, of course, I know it. Yeah, very
well.
Yeah,
of course. And it gave me a lot of comfort to retrain because I was with a group of other ex-city professionals who were all going into a similar role. And they provide you some of the training, the networking, and more like the community of people that are retraining. Now, the suggestion I put on the chat is something that I discussed with my partner, who talks about the recruitment and retention issues in the NHS as a pediatric nurse. And she said, well, why isn't there a now nurse kind of program? And by extension, I thought, well, and my idea there was, is there a way to work with governments or the private sector to have now code or now XYZ and build that out as well?
How interesting. So, it's such an interesting idea. And by the way, I should just say, Atish, hats off to you because I knew Lucy Kellaway, we worked together at the FT, and of course I followed her description of how you and some of your colleagues left some of these big jobs in the city and took up teaching, and just quite how tough it's been. So hats off to you. Russell, I'm going to bring you in too, because I knew you had a number of points that you've made in the chat.
Yeah, thank you. One thing I did want to just quickly mention is I think that a lot of the political discussion on education completely forgets that education is an investment. By giving people university quality education, by giving people excellent secondary education, they go on to earn far more tax money. And it is almost a surefire bet. We know that if someone goes and does an engineering degree, that the tax revenue that they will bring in goes up. So it shouldn't be looked at as going, oh, but where are we going to get the money from? The money will come back. Moving on to a more political direction, I was fortunate enough to have an internship at the House of Commons when I was 18. I quit my job in 2015 to campaign for the Labour Party with the man who is now Shadow Secretary for the Environment, Luke Pollard. So I've always been someone who's very politically active. After going into teaching, I'm now looking at saying, right, but how do we get from where we are now, having a discussion here today, where we're saying, right, on the recruitment crisis, on the exams issue, on lifelong learning, there are answers that we can come up with. There are things that need to be tried, but we have a government that is not trying them. How do we get from where we are now, which is policy failure? A large part of that is, and not to take away from Atish's and the schemes that people like Atish are on, that I also took part in, but subsidizing more and more and more recruitment doesn't fix the problem that is 8 years of there not being enough teachers willing to do the job. So I have really been looking at contacting representatives. I have issued open letters to as many of as many politicians as I can think of. I'm trying to work within the Labour Party to get them to take a harder stance on the dramatic need to address education. But how else can we start to affect and direct political change in order to fix the issues we know are in education?
Okay, thank you, Russell. Thank you. Well, listen, why don't we start trying to pull that together? Heather, can I come back to you, and can I come back to you on one specific issue, because your comment was around how businesses can transform the experiences and opportunities of life for presumably lots of people in those businesses. What happens if you're outside of the workforce? How do you think about, particularly in the US now with tens of millions of people unemployed, how does that adaptation advantage work in that context?
Well, I think I just want to back up for a second and say, we've kind of had this whole conversation within the existing paradigm, and I think that's part of the problem. We've got 5,000 years of recorded history and only a couple hundred years where we moved beyond just survival, where work and learning became something outside the home. And so life existed in three bands: education, career, retire, then die. And now I think it needs to be learn, leverage, and longevity. And learn and leverage means that learning implies no end state, and leverage implies that work and learning are now a combined act. Because if you look at what's happening within work, most of the skills that you learn are going to be obsolete within 5 years. So we focus on these technical skills, and many studies have found, like the 2018 IBM study, 2019 IBM study looked at top skills between 2016 and 2018. Technology skills are going down and human skills are going up. Is that because we don't need technology skills anymore? No, it just means more of us have them, and we haven't focused on the uniquely human skills. We're doing things like throwing out liberal arts because we can't figure out how you're going to get your first job, not realizing it's better preparing you to learn and adapt for life. So to answer your question about people who are outside of the workforce right now, a lot of folks are outside the workforce. So in the US, it's
sorry. Can I just I didn't get it down. Learn, leverage, and what was the other one?
Longevity.
Longevity. Okay, sorry. I just want to make sure.
Because we have we've got the greatest velocity of change at the same time we've made our greatest leaps in human longevity. So the conversation about a job for life is kind of an absurd question, which I think we've already covered. But we're coming out of the shareholder value era where we treated humans as a cost to contain instead of an asset to develop. And we're starting to see some shifts with that, like with what the Business Roundtable did last August. But for organizations, for individuals who are outside of organizations, there are 44 million Americans right now that are officially unemployed. But before that, we were seeing rise in gig workers. So they're outside of companies too. And there increasingly are platforms you can connect to. Like the way we lunge at skill sets, Upwork is one of the platforms, and it's a gig economy thing. I don't think that's a solution, but I think it's interesting the data they can collect. In 2018, they found that in a single quarter, 75% of their top skills weren't even on the list the prior quarter. So where we think we can signal to the market so we can train people to do things, we've looked at education as teaching you to do something as opposed to helping you figure out how to learn and adapt, helping you figure out how to develop agency and self-direction so that when you're outside of the world, you're inside or outside the workforce, you're always focused on increasing your capacity. Because I think organizations are just culture plus capacity. If you focus on brand and product, you're just focusing on the outputs. So I think a lot of this conversation is really answering the old questions with the new problems. And COVID is a crisis, but it's also potentially a catalyst to change some of this stuff.
Heather, thank you. It's so brilliant, and also I thank you in a very polite and calm and persuasive way, actually rightly calling me out for saying, look, this is so much about a mindset, and if you impose the old mindset on new problems, you end up with old answers. It was really, really helpful. I'm gonna finish up just by inviting Bob and Joe to have the last words. Bob, what would you most like to see happen next? Bob, you have to. Hold on, we can't hear you.
Ooh,
there you
somebody,
are. Gotcha.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah,
Good. Unmute me for reasons I don't know. Very quickly, because time's running out. I think with coronavirus, we need to think about building back better so that what we do after coronavirus is actually moves us on a whole number of agendas, including the agenda around learning and education. And that's my first point. My second point is to talk about the need for locally driven approaches. I absolutely agree with Joe that predict and provide is very difficult, and we've had plenty of national things that have not gone well, disasters you might call them. Why don't we devolve power and experiment at local level and then see what we learn? And then we'd be talking about our brilliant examples rather than always talking about Singapore.
Okay, Bob, thank you. And Joe, what do you want to see happen next?
Well, I mean, just very quickly, I would just echo, I think it was Jack who referred to teacher recruitment as being one of the most important aspects of the challenges we face. And I do think there is an urgent need, as we rethink the apprenticeship system, that we take a look at the apprenticeship levy and at whether it is genuinely supporting teacher recruitment. There is no real reason why we can't have an effective apprenticeship route to qualified teacher status. That would be transformational for number flows. At the moment, the rules and regulations around how you do it are Byzantine and over restrictive. Last year, we only had 46 people completing the teaching apprenticeship. And that's a ridiculously small number given the scale of the teacher recruitment challenge we face as a country, where we've got a shortfall of about 33,000 plus secondary teachers. So I think we need to have a big think about our apprenticeship system and change the apprenticeship levy so that it can support teachers on their way to QTS.
Joe, thank you. And likewise, thank you to Heather McGowan, and thank you to you, Bob Kerslake, Lord Kerslake. It's such an interesting conversation, this, and I'm so struck by what Joe Johnson said about approaching it with humility. There's almost been no thinking that we've had on a really substantial subject in the last year that at some point someone didn't talk about how we need to address things in our education system. And in this case, just listening to the scale of how we need to change the way we think, as Heather set out, the practical interventions that Joe and Bob set out, and what we heard from people, ranging from Atish to Russell to Lauren and to Lorna, really struck me that actually the complexity of this is huge, but it shouldn't be a reason for us to shy away from actually making practical suggestions. So I hope from our part at Tortoise, we'll come away from this, and when we do pull it all together, the outcomes of our education summit, you'll feel as though there's been an exercise in organized listening. We've genuinely heard points of view about how we change our thinking, but also practical suggestions, and whether it's about teaching or apprenticeships or investments in education and incentives around that, those things are spelt out in a way that's practical. Because I suppose I finished this thinking about what you said, Bob, which is that this COVID-19 crisis could be the great accelerator for a problem that people have talked about and worried over for decades, but made scant progress on. So I hope that that's the upshot of this. Thank you for your time. Thank you everyone for your time. This is truly an international thing. As you can see, there are people joining from all over the world. But one thing is very UK about it. It's lunchtime here, so we're going to take a break for an hour for lunch. And we come back at 2 o'clock to talk about how do we break the link between inequality and education. How do we change the dynamics in our education system to really address the social mobility and inequality issues in society? Chris Cook, my colleague and fellow editor at Tortoise, will be chairing that at 2. Please do join us, and in the meantime, have a good break. See you at 2. Thanks again, everyone.